Is there a season to burn, and are we now in it? Vice President JD Vance guest hosted the Charlie Kirk Show in the place of his assassinated friend. At the end of the webcast, Vance gave one of the most extraordinary closing monologues in TV history. Visibly upset in naming the Soros Foundation and the Ford Foundation as wealthy accomplices to violent left-wing radicalism, he promised little short of vengeance, a righteous fury that would purify America of the institutions and actors that have legitimized political violence. There can be no doubt that JD Vance spoke for tens of millions of Americans who are sick of the growing radicalism of the woke era. But how far will this vengeance go? Is the right now ready to take on the structures of power themselves? One man who might know is Curtis Yarvin. Yarvin is America's foremost advocate for the proposition that democracy is outdated. He represents a more radical view from Charlie Kirk of what should be done. For him, to take power always means to reform its deepest structures, and that requires a will to power that leaves little off the table. It's time to talk about the limits of anger. To whom can vengeance belong in a democracy? What does the present moment demand? Wrath and the future of the conservative movement, this time on View from the Danube. Welcome to View from the Danube. I'm your host, Rod Dreher. And this week we have on our panel Callum Nicholson, the Director of Research here at the Danube Institute, Zsófi Ratz, the Head of Communications, and our special guest is Curtis Yarvin, tech entrepreneur, blogger, co-parent of the Dark Enlightenment, and boogeyman of liberal America. Curtis, thanks for joining us here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My first time in Budapest.
Well, everybody in Budapest and seemingly all over the world is talking about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I got a text this week from a friend, an American priest in the jungles of Zimbabwe, who said even in the jungles of Zimbabwe, that's all he's hearing about, Charlie Kirk. I'd like to know what you all's reaction is, and maybe we can start by talking about the speech JD Vance gave. He, as we said, he hosted the Charlie Kirk's podcast, and just days after he buried his friend. And it was an extraordinary speech. Curtis, what were your reactions to the Vance broadcast?
Oh, I mean, I thought it was brilliant. I thought it really I thought it was, presidential. Why, And I think that actually, the assassination of Charlie Kirk has, when things happen in the world, sometimes it's because the world has changed with that happening. But it's also sometimes because things have been revealed that have to be seen, and
an apocalypse,
and apocalypse in the Greek meaning of the word, right? And so there's a sort of apocalyptic tone where you realize not, oh, this is a new thing, but this is the way things have been all along. Mm-hmm. And that apocalypse for me, actually, just in terms of a historical understanding of what this means. I think that it is too easily forgotten that the way that the present cultural dispensation and political dispensation in the United States got to be where it was involved a great deal of violence. And so, there's this great book by a guy named Brian Burroughs called Days of Rage.
Days of Rage, that's a wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book. And, if we follow the narrative, we were just like, oh, there's this old repressed 50s America, and then girls started wearing flowers in their hair, and we realized that everything was love. And you would never know that 5 bombs a day were going off in the US in 1972.
Yeah, Days of Rage, if you haven't read it, it's a history of the left-wing radicalism, radical violence from the late 60s through the early 70s.
Yeah, you recommended that to me.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
It's a fantastic book. And so when we forget basically that violence, violence is in sort of the root of leftism. I mean, leftism is essentially a satanic permission that you give yourself to sort of be as God, because to be, that's the essence of Satanism. And so you're taking this kind of personal Schmittian exception, and you're saying, yes, it is okay for me to do something wrong to make the world a better place.
Okay, so this is where JD Vance's speech comes in. It was probably the angriest speech I've ever seen a major politician give. And frankly, I think it was justified, given what had just happened. Did anything about that speech trouble you, Shofi? Did you happen to see it? You might not have.
I did, but I have to say, I agree with it, and I justify the anger. But I could also hear the anger in his wife's voice, in the wife's speech. I think maybe it's because I'm a woman, maybe it's not. It was way more moving for me. And I know the JD Vance speech, that was like a battle cry. And the wife also said that the voice, her grief, will now echo throughout the world as a battle cry, Erica Kirk. And for me, I've been thinking, I don't know if I would be able, as someone's wife who's just been assassinated, someone's wife, to do that, to stand in front of, I don't even know how many million people, and to be that strong, but to be that angry. Because of course you could see the sorrow and the pain in her eyes, and you could hear it in her voice, but the anger it was so easy to feel the anger, and that's what I have been feeling, which is very, very strange if you think about it. Like, I'm in Hungary, I'm a young person in Hungary. Kirk was a very well-educated man, so he might have known what Hungary was, but wouldn't be surprised if he had no idea that Hungary was actually an existing country, because he didn't have to. But again, right, the very next day after his assassination, there was a picture of him in front of the American embassy here in Budapest, and candles and flowers, which gives you a very good picture of what an impact a person can have without even knowing who he have touched while he was alive.
I want to come back to that in a second, but before we do, I want to hear, Callum, your response to JD Vance's battle cry.
Well, I mean, I actually haven't seen Vance's speech, but the thing's interesting for me was Charlie Kirk, and you and I were actually having dinner when it happened, and you showed me on your phone what had just happened. I never saw much of Charlie Kirk's actual content, and yet, despite that, it's been deeply sickening, the entire the notion of someone being shot. And it wasn't because it was someone I was familiar with or watched a lot of and had a sense of that's someone is part of my life. But I think what's so deeply sickening, beyond obviously the personal story of it, was it felt like such a crime against the creed of the entire Western tradition, the notion that you can go to the public square and have a debate. And I was thinking also that, we started The View from the Danube, this video cast. We started it a year ago, and I think our first episode was on the vibe shift. When Trump got elected, there was a sense of the vibe shift. But what's really interesting, a year on, 2 incidents in the course of a week didn't just demonstrate the vibe had shifted, but actually really the judgment had been made, because we had that incident with the Ukrainian woman being stabbed on the bus.
Zarutska.
Yep. And then within a week, I think it was, Charlie Kirk was shot.
A couple days.
Yeah, and these 2 instances completely smashed the myth of, or the politics of the left, the cultural cachet, the grip it had on the culture. I think these 2 incidents were, in a sense, the nails in the coffin of that.
Well, there's a way that you were supposed to respond to things like this. And you were supposed to respond to things like this in an apolitical way, because you were supposed to be defeated. And, the idea of, and what happened with Irina Zarutska is basically, it was just a minor news story. Oh, this thing happened. Actually, the guy's already been released. He's in he's being mentally evaluated. This has happened to him before.
Well, this had happened back in August, the throat slashing, and the city council in Charlotte, North Carolina, fought to keep the security video hidden.
Of course.
The predominantly black city council, I should say, because this was a black man who did this.
And there was we have there was something on BART, which is the subway in San Francisco, which is not, they're not a specific incident like this, but there was a little controversy where Bart was like, no, we need to keep the security camera footage, secret because it could cause people to become prejudiced. And I'm like, well, and so you're supposed to basically, you're supposed to ignore the potential of things like this as cause celebres, as organizing principles. You're supposed to take, when something happens like this, you're supposed to treat it as an accident, as if the train had broken down. There's been this, substantial attempt to depoliticize or even confuse the nature of the killer in the case of Charlie Kirk, and this sort of effort in the kind of way of shaping the narrative to avoid these delegitimizing questions is something conservatives have traditionally gone along with, and so if you look at sort of one of the sources of internet radicalization that happened, started to happen early in the 21st century, is basically this stuff gets passed around as samizdat in a way, and people are free to have their kind of visceral reactions of kind of rage and pain and associate these things with, where they come from. And these associations become, sort of forbidden. Let me give you another example. So, do you know that the number of degrees of separation between Kamala Harris and the Reverend Jim Jones?
Yeah, the Jim Jones, remind our listeners, he was the cult leader who had everyone drink the cyanide Kool-Aid.
Yes, and the thing is, and we all learn, Americans all know about Jim Jones. Actually, we want to avoid misinformation here, Rod. It was not Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid.
Flavor Aid.
That's poison in itself, isn't it?
A Kool-Aid company would be coming after us, So it was Flavor Aid, And but actually the political context of this has been completely removed.
Jim Jones was a progressive activist.
He was a progressive activist. He has 1 degree through multiple connections from Kamala Harris because he was a huge part of the San Francisco progressive machine in the 70s. He created, progressives looked at Jones and saw that he had this integrated church, which consisted of basically poor black people and rich white people. But, they were in the same building at least, and they all died together. And when, he declared his white knights mass suicide, he was like, our treasury goes to the Soviet Union, right? And so
he was a communist.
He was a communist, right? And they were all communists. The word progressive means communist.
I want to jump in here for a second. This is what I think was the most radical and to me welcome thing about JD Vance's speech. He spoke with such unshirted rage that I think a lot of people felt. But he said there can be no unity with people who support political violence. Now, that's not the sort of thing that you hear, that we're used to hearing from presidents. They're supposed to say we must come together, and they give these political bromides about how we're all one nation and all that. JD didn't do that. He said, we are going to go after these people.
Because they just proved that this is not a game that they are open to play.
Well, and I would take a little bit of issue with that because actually, of course, on the other side, they always wave the bloody shirt. If you think about, the response to the assassination of Martin Luther King, that is basically blamed on half the country. And that is basically taken, even George frickin' Floyd, who was a nobody, is taken as this casus belli almost for, this reordering of society. And actually, we don't see that we're a society incapable of waving the bloody shirt. Literally, King's bloody shirt was literally waved by Jesse Jackson, or it was Jackson's shirt, I guess. And so actually, it's part of the fact that we can see that the sort of whole illusion of debate in the town square, whatever, has been an illusion all along. Is that only one side has been doing this for 100 years.
Well, actually, it's interesting on this because I've been thinking about this problem of polarization. I have a friend who's just written a piece on this, and we were talking about it, and for years we've had this mantra that the problem in society is polarization. But actually, polarization is not new. And in a democracy, you should have a degree of polarization because you should have competing visions of how we ought to live. And indeed, what our problems are and how we ought to fix them. That's not the problem so much. The problem is not that we are more polarized now. I think the problem is we are losing the civic culture that allowed us to litigate our ideas and to debate in the public square. And so I think the problem is that we have, particularly from the left, this attitude that some things are beyond debate.
Well,
and
that's exactly what the killer said in his note. He said some politics can't be negotiated with.
Well, but here's what's interesting. I was trying to think about, in terms of Charlie Kirk's assassination, what does it remind me of? Now, there are obviously several assassinations that stand out as moments everyone remembers where they were. There's Kennedy, if you were alive then, my mother remembers Kennedy, and there was Lenin. Obviously, which she also remembers. And these are the ones
Lennon, not
John Lennon,
Well,
exactly.
Lennon was not killed by Sonia Copland, but it severely damaged his health.
But Kennedy, Lennon, King, of course, as well. But actually, if you look at Charlie Kirk, he wasn't a politician as such, and he wasn't just Lenin's assassination was an act of nihilism in a sense, or insanity, and indeed Reagan being shot was also quite apolitical, I believe. King and Kennedy, obviously, and both Kennedys were very much political. But what's interesting with Kirk is that I was thinking, well, whose assassination or whose murder does it remind me of? And I don't want to overstate his intellectual project as such and his deeper historical significance. But the closest I can think of is Socrates, because it's a bit of a Hemlock moment. Because what was Socrates killed for? Because he was basically not recognizing the official gods, and he was corrupting the youth. And Charlie Kirk was there, not bowing before the official gods of our millenarian culture of the woke left ideas, and he was corrupting the youth, according to some people. And there may not have been a gathering of people to say, and you now take the hemlock. But there is an interesting thing of someone sitting in the agora debating people and being killed simply for their ideas, not even for their power. And so I think in that sense, there's what we're missing here is not, the problem isn't polarization, the problem is the complete collapse of the civic culture that is intrinsic to the creed of the Western tradition.
Sophie.
Yeah, but no, that's the thing, that I think it has been proven now that the killer was actually at one of his forums and they were debating and Charlie humiliated him down to the ground.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
He's a former...
Yeah, he was at, I read that he was at one of these gatherings and that he asked the question and he didn't really like the answer. So I think the way this is different from the parallel with Socrates, the only reason I can see for him to do anything like this is because he felt that this was completely out of his hands. And this makes me very angry. Losing control and sensing that something is out of your hands is one thing, but you do not respond this way, because now what he has been able to do is now the movement that Charlie has started is even more powerful than it was before. And as Erica said, it has now unleashed something on America and the world that no one saw coming. Of course, we were familiar with his work, the way he was operating and what he was doing, but now even more people know about him.
Well, can I say, sorry, very quickly on that, is that interesting is an organization called Turning Point USA.
Turning Point USA.
Turning Point. And you know, the truth is, his shooting, I think, is a massive cultural turning point, not just for the USA, but for the entire of the West. In terms of suddenly, again, we had the vibe shift beginning last year, but this feels like a tectonic shift, a slipping of tectonic plates in what the stable ground of the culture is.
Well, you guys are being very optimistic. I mean, I think that the violence that we saw in Utah was essentially the violence of a very old regime that is not used to being challenged in this way. And I think it's easy to forget, for me, you know, this sort of Western culture of debate or whatever doesn't exist. It's like, actually what exists is like an alien thing, you know, wearing the skin of your mother. And it is not actually to be applauded for having eaten your mother and stolen her skin. And in this case, basically, you know, we have this thing called the Overton window, you know, the window of acceptable ideas. And those acceptable ideas are ideas that do not challenge the powers that be. The whole concept of an Overton window in the English-speaking world is about 100 years old. And it basically, you know, is coincident with the rise of American progressivism in the sense that progressive is a euphemism for American communism. It's not like Teddy Roosevelt progressivism. That's an earlier, bigger tent. And so actually, like, really by what you started to see in the internet, 20 years ago was essentially just random kids with, too much time on their hands started venturing outside the window. It's like, actually, if I, to describe the first moment in which I realized that, like, things were going to happen and history had not ended, was like 2005 or something. YouTube was a new thing. And I saw this video. I'm sure it's long since disappeared, but it was really just like kind of burned a hole in me. And it wasn't even a video. It was actually just a sequence of photos sort of presented with a kind of slow, animated zoom in, dissolve, sad piano music sort of over it. And the photos were in two sequences. So the even photos and the odd photos all matched. And the even photos were sort of brightly colored pictures of just like general Western, decadence, decay, rot, filth. We've all seen these things. And then interspersed between them, formal dress portraits of Nazi officers. And I'm just like, you watch this thing, you're just like, filth degeneration, bright, optimistic young man in Nazi uniform, filth degeneration, bright, optimistic young man in Nazi uniform, and you're just like, yeah, that's the thing. And like, basically,
that's the coming thing?
It's a form because it's basically,
that's the reaction.
It's breaking in a way. It's a totally forbidden thing, and that you watch it and you're just like, wait a second, something's wrong here.
Okay. That brings me to what I think is one of the most important questions here, one that the media are doing their very best right now to downplay. And that's, what is the significance of the fact that the confessed killer, Tyler Robinson, was in a romantic relationship with a transgender, a male to female transgender in the process of transitioning. And there is, as of this meeting here today, there's evidence that emerging that there were a group of transgenders around them who knew something was coming. Now, I think that this is a massive, going to be, and should be a massive factor here, because think about the recent assassinations or shootings we've had. Robin Westman in Minneapolis, who shot up a Catholic church and killed 2 kids, trans. The Covenant School shooter, Aiden Hale, who killed children and teachers at that Nashville school, trans. And we've had this over and over, trans people involved in this kind of violence. Now, I don't want to say that transgenders are murderous. Please hear me, I'm not saying that. But I do think that there's something radicalizing about, once you have crossed the line, that basic line of biology, something happens to people. And we're already seeing today, I don't know if you guys have seen this on Twitter, but Matt Gutman, a reporter for ABC News, one of the big American networks, did this tender little discussion about how once he saw the notes the FBI released, allegedly the notes that Tyler Robinson and his lover exchanged after the killing, Tyler Robinson was referring to his transgender lover as my love, my love. Matt Gutman said, it's really surprisingly touching that what was happening here. Walter Kern, the American commentator, said, this is how the media story is going to go. You had a clear act of evil, but now it's going to be muddied by the media and it's going to be turned into a Dog Day Afternoon type story, a crime of passion.
But what's interesting, at the same time, there'll be condemnation of the speeches of Vance or even Kirk's wife of saying they were emotionally compromised. And I think, because obviously if your friend is shot, then you will be very angry. So, and I think that the problem is, my concern is not what the narrative will be. It's always the hypocrisy. There's no consistency across how we actually assess these things. And I think there's actually on both sides on this, sometimes this is the case, quite honestly. But you asked about the trans element, and I don't know if there are legitimate cases of people being trans or not, but one thing that is certainly true statistically is it's become a viral sensation in the last 10 years. I once saw a chart that showed how eating disorders took off in sort of the early neoliberal period because, we were told to be in the 1980s and 90s, what came in were these very sort of market-driven ideas of the ideal body, and it led to a lot of eating disorders and so on. And so you had a rise of anorexia and bulimia. And what's interesting, there's an interesting graph I saw that around 2015, cases of anorexia and bulimia, the usual eating disorders, and body dysmorphia is what they are, dropped off. And as it drops off, transgender takes off. So it's become the new viral thing that when people are troubled, they turn to that as whatever the psychology of it is, they turn to that. So my point is simply within the trans, I don't like the word community because I'm not really sure what it means in this sense, but among people who have decided, and I don't think that they're necessarily tricking themselves, they may genuinely believe that they are trans, there will be a subset, of course, who are people who are very troubled in some way. And I think what we're seeing is if trans is now the catch-all identity for people who feel that there's something ill-fitting in their life, that they feel they're in the wrong body or something feels out of shape, then they'll turn to this, and thus you see these
Let me
extremists.
sharpen that a little bit, because one of the sort of things with the kind of the kind of last stage of the Marcusean cultural revolution that led to this is that being trans in our society today among young people is this tremendous source of power. Because let's say that you decide you should have a nickname. I decide that my nickname should be Wildebeest, and everyone should call me Wildebeest at school, right? I won't get very far basically trying to destroy people for calling me Curtis instead of Wildebeest. But simply the power of the pronoun thing and the power of the anti-dead naming thing says you have to respect me, you have to change the way you speak around me. It's a tremendous source of power. And people are really, really addicted to power. And the reason for the epidemic is simple. It basically makes you special. And it makes you special and powerful. And having the right to commit an assassination is just one more step in saying, I have the power.
Okay, I have a question for you, Curtis. You're famous for the concept of the cathedral, which I'll ask you to briefly explain. Is this, let me back up a little, one of the dogmas of the cathedral is trans is sacred. Gender identity is sacred. Only evil people question that. Will this murder of Charlie Kirk by a guy who apparently did it to defend the honor of his trans lover, will this be the bomb that blows up the cathedral?
Absolutely not. No. First of all,
what is the cathedral?
The cathedral is the U.S. media and educational establishment. It's sort of the brain of the regime. And what is sort of stunning about this brain of the regime is how, to steal a word from biblical scholarship, synoptic it is, and how you have this enormous variety of institutions that all sees the world in one way, even though there is no structure controlling them. They're sort of united by their ambition in a way. They're united by the sort of the power structure that they're within. And so this is why we don't have right-wing universities and right-wing newspapers. We kind of think we do, but they're not really real. Or they're not really part of this institution. And so actually to be part of the cathedral, it's like there's a difference. There's a qualitative categorical difference between the New York Times and the Washington Post versus the New York Post and the Washington Times. Right. To be a journalist is a rank. And if you are a quote journalist at the New York Post, you do not have that rank.
New York Post is the conservative tabloid in New York City.
You could never get hired from the New York Times to the New York Times out of the New York Post. Such a thing could never happen. You could certainly go from the Times to the Post, but it would be like a weird demotion and your friends would never talk to you again. And so, this is a power structure. And to say, this idea that logic is going to disrupt power is really characteristic of the sort of the ineffectual tradition in 20th century conservatism. It's and I'm no, actually only power disrupts power. You can't get it to disprove itself.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about the sort of monistic nature of the American educational system, because of course we're recording this in Hungary, and it is a bit more of there's more scope here for conservative thinking, and actually, we talk about trans. I always like to joke that in Hungary, the only trans issue that matters is Transylvania. So, but one thing I just wanted to throw in there, you mentioned the pronouns. And someone pointed out to me a couple of years ago, and I've never been able to forget it. He said, the thing is about the pronouns thing, he, him, she, her, they, them, is that you're policing people's speech when you're not around. Because I don't refer to you as he, them. I refer to you as that when you're not there. Oh, he is, wildebeest, as in your case. Wildebeest is, they are not here, or they are here. So what you're doing when you're saying, these are my pronouns, you're policing people's speech about you when you are not present. And that is what you're saying. It's precisely an exercise in power.
Okay, so what do we all think can be done and should be done about the problem that JD Vance identified of radical left and political violence? Sophie, what are your thoughts? How far should we go?
I don't know if we can do anything with them. I think this is just their nature. And I'm not optimistic in a way, just touching up on what you said. I don't think we can change them. This has been their nature ever since. You go back to Marxism or even take the French Revolution, they have always been like this. Being a leftist, a radical, a communist, these are just things that's just ingrained in their nature. I don't think that we can change this by any means.
If they're not going to change?
No, I think all we can do is keep doing what we do and stay like this, so we don't become them. We do not respond in a way in which we were attacked. I don't think there's considering how they are by their nature, I think that's a default, and I don't think that there's anything you can do to change them.
And I know Curtis Yarvin disagrees.
I definitely disagree. I would be very, very opposed to, symmetric responses to leftism are very, very bad. Definitely do not go out and start assassinating leftist politicians. It is, or pundits. That's, there will be 10 more. That's a completely useless measure.
That's why I said that we shouldn't do what they did.
Yes, we shouldn't do what they did. But the thing is, actually, the idea that basically public opinion is an unmoved mover and an absolute cause is empirically false. Public opinion in Germany and Japan in 1944 was very, 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 people believed, right? And by 1946, they did not believe. And in Germany, that process of change was accompanied by a lot of brutality in the early occupation. There was, because of MacArthur, there was none of that in Japan, and people simply followed the new power structure. The way you convert people is you change the power structure around them. What, animates the spirit of hungering for power that sort of animates leftism has always been around. The solution is to have a structure of power that does not leak. And when it doesn't leak, it's sort of like, yes, these people are power addicts and they can get power anywhere. Because we have a society, a very disordered society. But, there's, in a way, leftism is a kind of addiction. It's an addiction to sort of the feeling of importance. When you see the, deranged smiles on the faces of these people celebrating murder, it's just like you're a vampire and you're addicted to blood. And there's a famous result in addiction in which they looked at soldiers who'd become addicted to heroin in Vietnam. And when they came back to America, they just, in that day, they just couldn't find heroin. And so they just stopped being addicts. And, when you look, for example, look at how activated politically the Chinese people were in 1965. Right? The Cultural Revolution, it's a little later, I guess, but, they're fighting each other in the streets. Today, completely depoliticized nation. And so actually, if you basically take away the springs of power that feed these people, they will change their minds.
So what does that mean practically? What would you like concretely to see happen?
I think we should basically seize the assets of all nonprofits. I think essentially NGOs should be considered guilty until proven innocent. I think that, all of the privileged systems in the United States that are effectively part of the government, such as the private educational system. We all know that there's no real difference between a private and a public university. In America, they're part of a regime. And to consider these systems as part of a regime, to consider the privileges of, sometimes in Silicon Valley, people will be like, oh, should I do a startup to compete with the New York Times? And I'm like, you can't compete with the New York Times because it's a government agency. And it's a government agency because half of the things you see on the front page of the New York Times is basically information stolen from the government, given to the New York Times extra legally, which they then sell. And so actually, these are government agencies. And to realize that they are government agencies allows you to say, well, we're actually not living in this world of free and open institutions. We are living in a world that has no longer been that for quite some time. And yes, we can shuttle these things.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the New York Times, because I've noticed an interesting shift that these days the New York Times is, the left will say it's just a bastion of truth and the right will critique it as fake news, right? But if you go back to the 1980s, it was the other way around. Noam Chomsky wrote the book Manufacturing Consent, and he was saying how the New York Times is just partly state and certainly corporate media and run by the right, essentially. And then if you look back, I was reading a book
Nobody
called,
ever thought that on the right.
That's an even bigger lie.
Yeah, but the New York Times, I mean, I think if you look at it just as an example, I mean, I was reading a biography of Robert Moses by Robert Caro, the power broker. And Robert Moses, to control New York, basically just paid off the New York Times for decades. So it's got a long history on that. But one thing I just wanted to mention is that, I think one of the I think I may disagree with Curtis and perhaps agree with Sophie actually on this, because on this distinction that I think that the difference between the left and the right, and the reason why it's difficult therefore for the right to compete sometimes in the public square with ideas, and this is an idea I'm stealing from Roger Scruton. Scruton said the difference between capitalism and communism is communism is a description of the world as people think it ought to be, whereas capitalism is a description of the world as it is. And the problem is, if you have an agenda that's all about how the world ought to be, you will, of course, in pursuit of it, try everything you can, and in the end you'll think it's so important, violence perhaps is possible. But if you're simply saying the world is what it is, right, what is really your agenda of change? Because your whole point is about preservation, and and preservation is it's a very different spirit to that.
What's left to conserve? That's what I think. And I think about what we should do. I would not be nearly as radical as Curtis, but I do. Nobody is.
Why is that? Why is that?
Why is that? Because I don't want to see a civil war in America. And I've been a follower of David Betts, the professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, and he's been predicting civil war for the West. But he's not talking about two armies against each other. He's talking about something more like Beirut in the 1980s or Northern Ireland in the Troubles. And I don't want to see that sort of days of rage, right?
Entirely impossible, and let me tell you why. It's entirely impossible because the energy that created those things has been lost. It's been lost in Beirut. Nobody wants to have a civil war in Beirut. The fire has gone out of the hearts of these people. It's like comparing communism in 1989 to communism in 1917. It's in fact even like comparing Nazism in 1931 to Nazism in 1945. The West went in, the Allies went into Germany and used these very, very harsh, really criminal measures to suppress National Socialism. And they expected, werewolf terrorists to be everywhere, and they were nowhere. And they expected the same thing in Japan. They had kamikazes, right? They had these incredibly radicalized people. Nothing. Crickets, right? Because this is the way, human beings behave. And actually, if the measures that I describe, were taken, the idea of, it's like, here's an example of my, radicalism. I'm basically like, well, you shut down USAID. That was an amazing move. The people who did that did not even realize what they were taking on. It was one of the real citadels of the regime.
We saw that in Hungary,
They
too.
should have, and they should have gone farther and shut down the whole State Department. Now, sort of an American Gorbachev doctrine kind of move, because frankly, why do you need diplomats when you have Zoom, right? And I'm absolutely dead serious. And the idea that if you close the State Department and you fire 30,000 State Department officers or give them their pensions, that there will be barricades built in the streets of Georgetown is so utterly absurd and ahistorical that, the mindset of people who build barricades and do like Paris Commune stuff and is gone. It has vanished from the earth entirely. It's like comparing the society of the Roman Empire around 100 AD to the Roman Empire in 100 BC. In 100 BC, Romans are activated, they have street violence. The emperor, politics is dead. And actually the realization that fire is dead, if you take it seriously, if you did the things that, that I'm talking about, you would not see people sort of rise up in anger. You would see them shrink back in depression.
But you're making an argument here for you're saying civil war is not possible because the energy is dropped. The society is no longer, it's enervated, it's not as energized. Is that an argument for an enervated society? Or is it just an observation?
It's actually terrible that we have an enervated society. It's really bad. It's a really bad condition of society. But as Roger Scruton said, politics is the art of the possible. We are where we are. And actually, to pretend that we live in a Western society that is all about open debate and all this stuff is actually living in a fantasy world. And you are not effective when you try to act in a fantasy world.
But Curtis, in 2020, the George Floyd riots burned down cities. That's not an example of an enervated society. I tend to believe that what we're faced now, post Charlie Kirk, is a battle not between left and right, but between chaos and civilization. And I hope and expect that JD Vance and the Trump administration will move swiftly and strongly against NGOs and all those who fund this radicalism. The thing that worries me, though, is that we will act wrongly out of anger, and I'll tell you why. I remember very well being in New York City on 9/11. I was standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, saw the South Tower come down, traumatized by it like so many were. I was willing to believe anything the U.S. government said that justified going to war in Iraq. Anyone who said it was wrong they were either a coward or a fool.
Many of them were.
What's that?
Many of them were.
But, 3 years later, I realized that I had allowed my desire for vengeance. I just wanted bombs to fall on some Muslim SOB. And I was wrong about that, And so that taught me something about we have to be very, very careful not to let our righteous anger, even though it's righteous, take us too far.
So there's a really important distinction.
Hang on.
No. Here comes the comparison, because you mentioned George Floyd. Everything that happened after his death, cities burning, the whole America is in flames. Charlie Kirk dies, and you see hundreds and thousands of people together praying.
Yeah.
So I'm not. That's exactly why I'm saying that we cannot become like them, because as Charlie said, you can tell a lot about a person based on how they react to someone's death. And with his death, he has proven this point perfectly.
I would say that I think this is a line of Maestra's. The difference between action from the left and action from the right is the difference between butchery and surgery. And actually, we are looking at a West that needs extremely radical surgery, but does not need any butchery whatsoever. And when you're doing surgery, you're cutting, you're using a knife. It is an act of your, blood flows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, your goal is to maximize the effect while minimizing the pain. And so, when I look at basically, say, the shutdown of East Germany, that's surgery. That's just like nobody's hurt. Nobody is like extraordinary radical change in the nature of a regime without any violence is possible. And actually what happens to the people, if you look at, let's sort of zoom in on the fall of East Germany for a moment. Imagine that you're a major in the Stasi, right? That's like being a New York Times reporter. That's a position where everyone around you is just like, you're the most important person in the room. When you come into the room, everyone is deferential to you. And you as a major in the Stasi, feel yourself to be an heir to this long revolutionary tradition. It goes back to Rosa Luxemburg, and you're just like, you've been taught that even if the capitalists were to invade and take over, you'd be fighting in the streets, you'd be planting bombs. And then this happens and you realize that you were not a revolutionary, you were never a revolutionary, you're an old guy with a job. Now you're getting your pension from the West German government and you want to take care of your roses. And even, the former weathermen, do you really think that Bill Ayers would go back to planting bombs if he lost his job?
Or Angela Davis.
Or Angela Davis. No, they wouldn't. They're done. They're like the late Bolsheviks. They're not like the early Bolsheviks.
Well, let me ask the panel something. I didn't know, I knew who Charlie Kirk was, but I thought he was nothing more than a MAGA influencer. Yeah, that's not my generation. I'm one of the olds.
I'm sorry, but I have to just very quickly. For us, he was big.
Okay, well,
especially because of that.
Can I say, just on this though, it's been very interesting on Hungarian social media. My friends in Hungary who, colleagues and friends of friends and so on, anyone under 40 essentially, younger than me, all the social media was, they all clearly were watching Charlie Kirk content.
Because we knew who he was and we knew what he was doing.
Okay, well, that's the question though. Why has there been this extraordinary global outpouring of interest and sympathy for Charlie Kirk?
And why was it different from Trump's assassination attempt? And I think it's because when you run for a president or you openly engage in an activity that could result in something like this, you're kind of, okay, that's part of the job. And I don't know why. I've been thinking about this for days. Why haven't I been moved by Trump's assassination attempt as much as this person who I was familiar with but didn't know as much about him as Trump? And it's because he was not running for president, he was not a public officer, he was not someone who knowingly went into battle knowing that he can get shot. He was a husband and a father and a public figure or influencer or talking head, whatever you want to call him. And he got murdered in a way against what he was talking about in his whole life, and he based his whole life on dialogue and
he was a normie Republican he was a very corny guy. I mean, I don't say that as a criticism. He was corny.
He stood for issues that are that easily polarize the society. He fought a fight against Planned Parenthood. He took a very clear stand on the unborn situation. So he was a corny guy,
But what I'm saying, though, is he was completely normal. Not normal to a lot of these leftists who...
I wanted to touch upon what you said about the whole, transgender thing. Do you know what was the most frequently asked question when he was doing these rallies? Yeah. What is a woman? And he never was able to get a clear answer from anyone. And all these trans people
Charlie
went there.
asking the
yes,
liberals.
there was a guy dressed up as a woman. It was horrific. And I'm sorry. And then he was like, okay, let me ask you something. What's a woman? And the guy's like, oh, dude, I know that's your line, but that's hard. I don't know.
Yeah.
Most used line, what's a woman? No one could answer him, the trans people who went there. So
they shot him.
So they shot him.
Why was he popular outside of America?
Well, especially in Hungary, I think, because the culture of open and honest debate, especially on university campuses, is something that is near to non-existent. And we do not have a history or a tradition of having clear and open debates. I was at the law school a few years ago. Professor goes out to the stage from which you are not supposed to say any political statements, and goes into this 20 or 30 minute rage about how you should go and vote for a specific party, which was not the government, and fight for your rights because this country is a dictatorship and blah, 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 blah. Of course, if you live in that, you don't have the courage to stand up against that, because you feel if the professors are like this, if the people, and I agree with you 100% on the NGOs. I just don't see that happening, but I agree with you in theory. If you feel that this is your school, it's not just university, your high school, you feel like, okay, these are the people who are who's supposed to tell me what to do, or who possess the knowledge that they are conveying to me, and especially as a young person.
They're authority figures.
Yes, I mean, how old? Like 21, or how old is the guy? Like 21 who killed him?
22.
22. So exactly, you are in the state of being easily brainwashed into this madness.
Well, this a really interesting Substacker named Tanner Greer wrote a very persuasive piece explaining the meaning of Charlie Kirk to the young. He said, if you were a young Republican on campus, you were afraid.
Exactly.
You had to be afraid for the reasons you say.
Yes.
And here Charlie Kirk comes to town or comes to your campus, and he's not afraid. Yes. And he's cheerful, and he's a man of conviction. And he gives you the courage not to be afraid.
He was actually asked once, what happens if you die? And he said, what do you want to be remembered for if you die? And he said, my courage and my faith. And with his death, sadly, but he has completed both of these goals or missions that he had for himself.
And I think it speaks to the fact that, I think I may have mentioned this earlier, but I do think that, like, when I saw it, I really felt physically ill. I was waking up for about a week of actually feeling quite nauseous or nauseous, and really quite ill, actually. And sometimes when you have to remember it, it was this horrifyingly heavy feeling. And that's not as someone who'd ever seen this. I'd seen his face on reels on Instagram, and I'd not really stopped. I don't really follow the influencers like that. But I think it's that his death, the reason I think it resonates so strongly, is that it's really an attack on the central creed of the entire Western tradition, the notion that we can go into the public square and debate, whether we're good or bad at it, the notion that we can go there. And the thing is, what's interesting about his death is that if you think about it, it's along with the Kennedy assassination, it's the most public death, because Kennedy was shot on camera. Yeah. Charlie Kirk was also shot on camera, obviously, but actually very equivalent in terms of the sheer violence of it.
Better cameras.
Better cameras.
Unfortunately, yes.
But actually quite similar in some ways. And and I have the sense that as a consequence, it is probably historically quite a significant. I think it's going to be remembered as a real turning point, because we realize that, this is the tradition that is our tradition, and he was there representing, whether you agreed with him or not. He was out there, and if you didn't agree with him, he would welcome you to the show to actually to have a debate with you.
Well, I'll say this too. I think that those two deaths, the Irena Zarutska, which was only revealed 2 or 3 days before Charlie Kirk's killing, and Charlie Kirk, they revealed the bankruptcy of the ideological hegemony of the left in these ways. What have been the left's two biggest forces in the culture war? Race ideology, BLM and all that, the carceral state, all the things we had to hear about how white supremacy is what's wrong in this country, and so on. And gender ideology. So we saw this mentally ill black man who should have been off the streets, 14 arrests, slashed the throat of an innocent woman. That was so powerful, because it turns out that the judge the magistrate who turned him loose, she didn't even have a law degree, right? Yeah. And that just shows, I think people have just had it with this idea that the real problem is white supremacy. And then you turn to Charlie Kirk, who has been shot and killed by a man who it is claimed was defending the honor of his transgender lover.
And Charlie Kirk actually tweeted after Zarutska's death, "America will never be the same," dies 1 day later, literally proving that America will never be the same.
And then finally, the mass celebration among so many on the left of these murders. I think that it's an apocalypse, as you started out.
It's an apocalypse. And I want to draw, not to Putin or anything, but I want to draw our attention back to history. So in 1453, in 1860, of course, America, fell into its civil war. And what really triggered, not to relitigate the Civil War, but of course what triggered the Civil War was, this mad expedition by the leading American terrorist of his time, John Brown. And what really blew, it's often forgotten that the leaders of the Confederacy were actually the Southern moderates, and they were not the fire eaters. Jefferson Davis had been one of the leading voices against secession in 1850. And what changed the mind of the Southern mainstream was not so much this crazy terrorist expedition of John Brown, but the response to it in the North. And the fact that it could no longer be denied that basically most of the chic people in Boston thought John Brown was actually really groovy and actually had been financing John Brown, was really like, actually, no, we can't live with these people. And understanding that similarly among the American right today, understanding that actually, no, this is not our country, this is a leftist country, and the organizing principle of leftism is a kind of right to violence that they claim. And yes, they are very hypocritical in claiming that they have this right and we do not.
We have to come to an end. It's signaled by the producer that our time is up. Last question. We always remember what we had with someone after they're gone. Who is the person that you would like to shout out as having made a difference to the conservative movement, who possibly does not receive the kind of respect or appreciation that we now all offer to Charlie Kirk, someone living today who is undervalued on the conservative movement? Who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, from an intellectual point of view, I think someone that we'll look back on in the future and see him as someone who gave us a frame of reference to understand what is ailing our society, and what is ailing our society is leading to the various solutions people are offering on the different sides of the spectrum, and sometimes solutions that I think are less cures for the problem, but symptoms of the problem, quite frankly, is Ian McGilchrist, an amazing thinker that I think has a conservative sensibility in some ways, in as much as
he's not political, but
he's not. But there is a non-political there is a patient type of conservatism. There is a restraint in his thinking, and I think he's a profound and eloquent articulator of a way of seeing not just the solutions but the problem. Because I do think one of the big problems we have in society is everyone is misdiagnosing the problem. Everyone is confusing cures with symptoms and so on. And I think actually, one last comment on this is that, we became modern in terms of how we understand the physical body when we had the biomedical revolution, where we could discern the difference between a symptom and a pathology, the Black Death pustules from what causes it. I think in terms of how we understand the body politic, we are still medieval. We have not evolved how we look at it. We keep confusing symptoms and pathologies.
Ian McGilchrist. His great book is The Master and His Emissary, followed by an even greater book, a very big book called The Matter with Things. I highly recommend it. Zsófi.
Ever since the incident happened, there has been around 55,000 requests from high schoolers and university students throughout the USA to join the chapters at the Turning Point USA campuses. So I'm going to shout out them because they had the chance to be afraid, and it would have been completely justified if they chose to be afraid, but they chose to. When it was the hardest and everyone was against them, I think they did the right thing by carrying on the legacy.
So the anonymous activists.
The anonymous activists, because in a few years they will be the ones who we are talking about today.
Curtis Yarvin.
I would like to say my friend Steve Saylor. I think that Steve, who is a boomer, but we won't hold that against him, was really, the writer who taught me that it was possible to think clearly outside the Overton window without fear, or maybe with
briefly,
a little bit of fear.
who is Steve for our listeners?
Steve is a journalist. He was actually a journalist for UPI, back in the 90s, and he started to realize that. In his term, he noticed many things that people were not allowed to notice. So, for example, the death of Irina Zarutska, and sort of noticing that it's sort of completely insane. I mean, to subject, one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence is that the king has aligned himself with the Indians and has subjected civilized people to the ravages of uncivilization. In the 20th century in America, there were vast ethnic cleansings that were precipitated by events like Irina Zarutska's that we were not supposed to notice.
But Steve Saylor noticed.
But Steve Saylor noticed.
Yeah, and a lot of people in America in the journalism class say they would never read Steve Sailer, but they do. I'll close out by saying, and this is, I feel bad saying this because this is kind of cheesy, but I would say Viktor Orban, and I'll tell you why. When I first came to this country 4 years ago, I was really amazed at what an illiberal democracy, by which he meant a Christian democracy, what it could do. What a man who was willing to put a lot on the line to defend the borders, to defend against gender ideology, to defend against George Soros, what he could accomplish. And I've been writing for the last 3 years that the American right has so much to learn from the way Viktor Orban practices politics. He's a realist. And I think that in time, he will be seen as a prophetic figure, especially in Europe. Last point on that, just in the past week, I've had two prominent people, one from London, one from Paris, come into town, and they both said to me, what an amazing city Budapest is. You can see young women walking around at night. They're totally safe. That would never happen in London or Paris. I'm like, that's right. And that's because of Viktor Orban. So I think that he, one day, he's hated in Europe now, despised by the American political and media establishment, but one day they're going to miss him. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining me. Curtis Yarvin, our special guest, Jofi Ratz, and Callum Nicholson, as always. I'm Rod Dreher. Thanks for joining us on View from the Danube.